Welcome to a miscellaneous reading diary. I am your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and today is going to be the first of two episodes in which I cover House of Leaves by Mark Danielewski, and a book that is making up basically my only spooky season read for 2025, and which I'm having a really enjoyable time with so far. We'll get into all the details of that later in this video. First, I should specify that I'm not entirely sure how much detail even the spoiler section of this video is going to go into. It's just going to be like me basically summarizing a little bit of what I understood of what I read, and kind of maybe making a couple of guesses at what might be to come. But quite frankly, I'm still early enough at this point in this diary that I don't really have any theories for what's to come yet in the book, and I don't really know how much I have to say about what I've read so far. But for a spoiler-free kind of introduction, just my general impressions, my first impressions of House of Leaves, having read right around a quarter of the material so far, or rather a quarter of the pages that have material, because if you know anything about House of Leaves, you know there's no small number of books that have, or pages that have basically no words on them, and then there's other pages that have a lot of words, you know, just kind of like normal. So I'm not entirely sure how much of the actual content I've read, but in terms of like page count, I've read approximately a quarter of the pages. It probably doesn't look like I've read that much based off of where that bookmark is. And that's because that bookmark is only 100 pages in if you include the introduction, which I do for this book. And then I've read about 60 pages of one of the appendices, because I was sent to one of the appendices with a footnote in this book. And if you don't know anything else about House of Leaves, you may have heard that it's kind of like two stories happening concurrently, because you have... Man, how do you even really talk about what this is? This definitely isn't an Infinite Jest situation. This is how I should probably talk about my spoiler-free impressions. If you'll remember, on this channel about a year and a half ago, I started covering Infinite Jest, and then that took me a number of months. I believe September of 2024 was when I finished reading Infinite Jest, or rather when my final reading diary on the book came out. Would have been probably late September or somewhere thereabouts. And Infinite Jest is definitely an intensive novel to read, not least because there are plenty of sections where the writing of it and some of the things going on are pretty hard to parse, pretty hard to understand. You're really having to work to get information out of it. And then there's also a little bit more of the meta side of the actual reading experience, which involves going to endnotes, and where several of those endnotes will send you to other endnotes. That's a thing that happens quite often in Infinite Jest, and that makes the reading process a bit laborious. That would be a term that you could absolutely use for that book. And going into House of Leaves, I wasn't expecting it to be like Infinite Jest levels of crazy for sure, but I kind of had my mind geared for something a little bit more inherently intensive that way when reading it, and I think that was the right approach, even though this is a lot easier actually. You have a couple different stories going along concurrently. You have the main text of House of Leaves, which is a set of material. It's basically a commentary on a non-existent documentary or a non-existent film, or maybe existent film. In real life, it doesn't exist, but within the context of the book, it may or may not exist. So you have a commentary on this film, which is essentially like an analysis, a very pieced together understanding of like a found footage film. You're basically getting the pieces of a found footage film told to you as if like they're happening before you, and there's little bits of commentary happening with that. There are footnotes associated with that commentary, and all of this is also undergirded's not the right word. All of this is also boxed in by another commentary by another person on the complete outside, who is like piecing all this stuff together, because the frame device is that this material for this commentary of this film were found in this dude's apartment who died, and the person who is putting this stuff together became obsessed with it and it really affected his life. And that's basically as much as I can say in a quote-unquote spoiler-free context. That's like the very rough basis of what's going on here. You have a found footage film essentially being described to you, and you have a couple layers of commentary going on with that. That's basically what House of Leaves is, and I'm really enjoying that conceit. I'm really enjoying the tone of it, and I think that basically everything it is trying to do at this point is working for me so far, although I have some question marks about like the outermost layer of the story, but we will get into that in all due time. As far as like my enjoyment, really enjoying this. The tone of everything that I've read so far has been such that like I could see this being an all-time favorite if nothing goes horrifically wrong with the telling of the story, or if it doesn't, start to really grind its gears, or if it doesn't pull an Infinite Jest moment and just not contain the entire end of the story like Infinite Jest decided to do for some reason. But yeah, I guess that's probably how I'll stop the spoiler-free section of this for now and go into the spoilers. And like I said, I'm not entirely sure how much detail I'm going to include here. I'm not entirely sure what I really have to say, but for the purposes of today's video, we'll briefly discuss like the introduction a little bit, and then a couple of the early chapters of the book, or the early chapters of the Navidson record, actually, because the Navidson record, like I said, is the bulk of what the book is in the first place, and the first few chapters of that, plus a tiny bit of the appendices, like what I mentioned. I'd read 60 pages of the appendices that the book had sent me to at the end of chapter 5. So that's what we're going to cover today. Okay, first, to understand what House of Leaves actually is, you have to understand what the introduction is doing. There's 20 pages, or somewhere thereabouts. It's probably more like 15 pages, but you have like 15 to 20 pages of introductory material, which is written by like the outermost commentary narration of the book, Johnny Truant. The very opening of this book, let's see if we can find the title page. You have, Mark Danielewski's here, House of Leaves, but it says it's by Zampano, and introduction and notes by Johnny Truant. So Johnny Truant is the one who writes the introduction in this, the in-world story of the book, I guess, where he describes in the introduction this dude called Zampano, and like what kind of role in the neighborhood this Zampano dude played, and then when he died, basically, and how everybody knew when he died because all of a sudden his daily routines were like not happening, and everybody kind of took notice of that. So he died, and Johnny Truant and one of his friends, I forgot the friend's name off the top of my head at this point. I don't actually have any notes prepared for this diary like I normally do for diaries, so forgive me for that. But Johnny Truant and his friend, he gets roped into entering Zampano's old apartment before all of this stuff gets taken away by charity shops and stuff like that. And they find a chest. They bring out a chest where Johnny finds a whole bunch of scraps and pieces of like a book and stuff that he becomes obsessed with putting together. And that's basically what the Navidson record is effectively all about here, is the writing about a house, a mysterious house, liminal spaces involved, stuff kind of like that going on. And Johnny describes how he found this record, how he became obsessed, and kind of the very negative effect that this has very obviously had on his personal life, because the introduction is framed as having been written after the entire rest of this product has been written effectively. What the binding of House of Leaves is having like a publishing house, editors of some publishing house having kind of discussed with Johnny Truant about this book and put the pieces together to actually be published, but that was following Johnny Truant actually putting things together in his obsession with this product, which itself kind of followed Zampano kind of compiling stuff together and making commentary and all of this kind of stuff, and that's basically what you have here. It's a very complicated, multi-layered product of just commentary of stuff that may or may not exist. And I say may or may not exist very purposely, like I did previously in the spoiler-free section, because a notable part of building the tone of the introduction was Johnny Truant, as the narrator of the introduction, straight up saying at one point effectively that there's so much stuff mentioned in this commentary of the Davidson record that doesn't actually exist, and stuff that I can't actually find to actually exist, references that don't make sense, and material that just straight up can't be found. So Johnny Truant purports that a significant chunk of like the footnotes and stuff that are primarily associated with the Davidson records, footnotes that would have been in there as a result of Zampano when he was compiling information and stuff like that, that much of the names and actual pieces of work that have been associated with those names and in those footnotes and stuff that are referenced within the Davidson record commentary work, that a lot of this stuff supposedly just straight up doesn't exist, and that it's kind of crazy that something so deep has been able to be made of something that, again, may or may not actually exist. I'm not entirely sure one way or the other at this point. It may have been revealed or like confirmed at some point or another. I'm not entirely sure, but I'm not entirely sure yet if the Davidson record, which, for the record, there's two things within House of Leaves that are called the Davidson record. One of them is a film that has been made by a guy named Davidson who moves into a house whose interior dimensions do not match the exterior dimensions, and more importantly, the interior dimensions are bigger than the exterior dimensions, and therefore kind of weird stuff is going on with this house because that's evidently not very possible. The Davidson record is the film. There are also some other like mini sort of like short film stuff that are associated with this sort of documentary film thing that Davidson has made. And then the Davidson record is also the name of a commentary piece that has been written about this film, and the commentary piece is what this book effectively is. The 23 chapters of the book, as I'm describing them for these couple of diaries, like today we're going to talk about chapters 1 through 6. These chapters are the chapters of the Davidson record commentary. The pulling a layer back, Zampano's commentary upon the Davidson record are kind of the footnotes, the primary footnotes, and then every once in a while Johnny Truant includes footnotes, and there's also a couple footnotes from the editors a couple times as well. But Johnny Truant's introduction kind of gives us an idea of what we're about to experience with the Davidson record and how much of an effect that had on him while he was working on it. And it's just a really great tone builder. Like, I really loved the introduction of House of Leaves. It was incredible. But immediately after the introduction, you actually get taken into the Davidson record itself. And, well, there's a good bit to talk about here. And I'm not entirely sure, like I said multiple times at this point, how much I really have to say about it. But I'm going to try to like kind of pull through some random thoughts that I have. Most of these early chapters are pretty short. Like chapter 1's only a handful of pages, and chapter 1's kind of giving us the foundation for what the Davidson record is within this commentary context, right? So it talks about the production of the Davidson record and like what actually a little bit of the more technical background is, and relates that with some of the short films that came before the Davidson record that I mentioned. So a couple films that were never like properly distributed, but that were produced by Davidson about his house, things that were called like Exploration Number 4, and I forget exactly what Exploration Number 4 is, but that also pairs along with another film called like The 5.5 Minute Hallway or something like that, where you have brief descriptions of these short films that are like, here's a liminal space within a house, and here's us like showing how this space is straight up impossible in reality. And people who have like tried to analyze the film, there are some naysayers, of course, but there are other people who are just like, there's no like real technical cutting or anything like this happening in this film or in this short film or whatever. So like, whatever this guy's doing to make this thing happen in this film is really crazy type of techniques he's got going on, great filmmaking stuff, or otherwise what he's depicting is just straight up true, and that's really disturbing. So you have a couple different angles of that side of the commentary, and then of course the people who think it's all just faked somehow, who think all of this is a hoax. But there's these couple of short films, the 5.5-minute hallway, and then exploration number 4, and then that's basically the basis for giving us the context for what the Navidson record itself is, because later the Navidson record itself as an entire film does become more properly distributed and kind of overshadows the previous little shorter pieces that were never really properly distributed, where the Navidson record was, and a lot of people have come across it and seen it, and that's what this commentary becomes about. That's largely what chapter 1 is about, is kind of setting the stage, giving us a little bit of reference with these couple of shorter pieces of film, and then the Navidson record with it. You don't really have a whole ton of stuff going on in the footnotes or anything in chapter 1 either. They're all pretty basic. Even Johnny Truant's footnote inclusions in chapter 1 are pretty basic, like just finding a couple of translations for things, and like that's the bulk of it. But chapter 2, I don't remember exactly. I was gonna try to write down some of this stuff a little bit better, while reading, but I just haven't had time the last few days. Let me try to figure out what chapter 2 was actually about. Okay, chapter 2, sensibly enough, is largely about setting up the family that the Navidson record is essentially about. The Navidson record is about this weird, funky house, but it wasn't originally meant to be that, because originally Navidson and his family, family named Karen, his wife, and then Chad and Daisy are his kids, these 4 moved to a house on Ash Tree Lane, apparently. I forget where this is precisely set, but they moved to a new house where they're essentially like kind of starting a new life, and Navidson wants to kind of document this. He wants to document this new foundational upbringing, this new start to a journey for his family. That's the purpose of this documentary, and chapter 2 is largely setting up that goal and introducing us to those characters and kind of some of their dispositions regarding each other, kind of where they're at as a family. We get some hints about some of like Navidson's past, for example, particularly with regard to taking off to do photography stuff at random places for X amount of time, that being something that his family just kind of had to grow up and get used to, because his job prior was doing photography related stuff. That's something that he's done, part of why his documentary here in this book as being regarded upon. You get a lot of random little mentions of how like the editing and the framing and stuff like that of the Navidson record as the film is good, largely partly because Navidson's background in photography kind of gives him a little bit of a step up on a little bit of a production standpoint in this regard. But yeah, chapter 2 is largely kind of giving us an idea of like what his family's actually like, and what the purpose of this documentary was originally supposed to be about, as opposed to what it actually ended up becoming. I don't believe there's anything about chapter 2 that actually gives us the hint that the house is super off yet. I want to say it doesn't. I'm pretty sure that doesn't happen until chapter 3, but chapter 2 does give us our first moment of Johnny Truant kind of circumventing the traditional flow of the narrative otherwise, with his own very lengthy, rambly footnote that kind of doesn't really have that much to do with the actual work. With the Navidson records, kind of more just rambling about himself and a couple things that he's had going on recently, to the time that he wrote the footnote. Although this footnote in chapter 2 is arguably the most relevant of his lengthy inclusions up to this point that I have experienced, but it also gives us a little bit of a hint that Johnny Truant specifically is not a super reliable narrator, and that he's not inherently against tampering with the actual Davidson record that we're reading otherwise, to a degree that may or may not be significant. And this is exemplified to us through an interaction where Davidson returns home to, Karen and his kids, and Karen tells Davidson something like, hey, the water heater's on the fritz. He asks her, when did that happen? She says, I guess last night. And this prompts a little bit of a footnote where Johnny Truant goes on about his water heater going out and the irony of this water heater going out. But at the very end of his footnote, which is multiple pages long, by the way, this happens a few times, this multi-page footnote kind of gets to a point where Johnny Truant admits that actually wasn't what Karen had said. She didn't actually say anything about the water heater being on the fritz, just that the heater was on the fritz, and that Johnny Truant inserted the water part of that into the actual Davidson record for whatever reason, maybe just to be able to ramble about his own water heater or something like this. It's not entirely clear, but it does give us the idea that he is not against tampering with the Davidson record, and he makes comments like this in various other chapters as well, times like, I wouldn't even have included this part of the Davidson record, this part of what Zampano compiled into this commentary here, if it weren't for this one line here that really spoke to me for some reason, even though these other lines didn't really seem to be relevant to the narrative. I wouldn't have been against cutting them, but this line resonated with me. So you have to wonder what lines are actually being cut, what material is genuinely being notably tampered with by Johnny Truant, and what of it is a little bit more accurate as far as the Davidson record is concerned. It's kind of hard to tell, but chapter 2 starts to give us an idea of what Johnny Truant is like, a little bit rambly, not unsophisticated. He has some intelligence there. You can tell he reads a lot, and we learn a little bit later that he did spend at least a little bit of his time, in his preteens, probably reading a lot of books. He uses some big words and stuff like that, but he also seems to have a lot of mental issues, a lot of trauma, and again, we learn a little bit about that later if we read part of the appendices that we're prompted to at the end of chapter 5. But that's chapter 5. We're still talking about chapter 2, but that covers the bulk of what I feel like I really have to say about chapter 2 so far as what I've read so far. There's a couple other points in here that are kind of hinted at with regards to Karen's and Davidson's relationship within the record that I don't really have much to say on, that might come back around to mean something a little bit different later in the book, but I don't really know yet. But chapter 3 moves us into a little bit more of the rambling nature of Johnny Truant, and kind of getting into stories that don't really have any inherent relevance to what's going on, I don't think. I don't remember all of these footnotes, but he goes on about him and his friend and various different escapades that they've been on at one point or another. He goes on about sort of his time doing... Actually, chapter 3 isn't when he starts really rambling about his time working at a tattoo shop that he works at, but chapter 3 is very brief and kind of gets into some literary references that are being made with regard to the Davidson record, but nothing that I really remember aside from introducing the concept of the house being a little bit off. That's kind of where chapter 3 happens, is you get a little hint that the house is a little bit off, but that's it basically. You don't have a whole lot. It's mostly just kind of extraneous commentary, and again a long footnote from Johnny Truant that honestly I don't even really remember. These first couple lengthy footnotes from Johnny Truant are at least kind of giving us insight into his character being apparently a good storyteller to some degree. The first footnote that was in chapter 2 featured him telling a story to a couple of women that was completely made up, but that they found pretty entertaining, and that his friend would sometimes insert into the stories and force Johnny to have to riff on some of the things that he would just randomly include. This footnote in chapter 3 kind of did a similar thing where you have a story being told that is evidently not really true, that's basically being made up on the spot, more or less told to random characters, which I guess gives us more insight into the unreliability of Johnny Truant as a narrator within the footnotes. But again, it's kind of hard to really tell what precisely all those details mean at this point. Chapter 4 goes a little bit deeper into the actual problems being arisen with the house itself, however, because it tells us within the Navidson record section that the Navidsons went on a trip to Seattle in June of 1990. They went to a wedding, and when they had returned, there was something about the house that was different. The house had changed in the time that they were gone. This introduces to us the first problem about the house. Something's different compared to when they left, and there's no indication from any of the cameras that were left in the house when they left, in between then and when they got back, that anybody had come into the house to tamper with anything, even though anybody coming in to change the house in the way that it was different would be strange in and of itself. And then you have Navidson getting pretty obsessed with the change associated with the house, noticing that, again, the dimensions of the inside of the house are different than the outside. Notably, in the chapter, the inside is 1/4 of an inch bigger than the outside is in terms of width of the house, I believe, is the dimension that they're talking about. And this disconcerts Navidson enough that he even goes so far as to call his estranged twin brother, who kind of works within construction field and stuff, to come over, to come visit, and to help him and have better tools to ensure that he's not measuring the inside of the house wrong. And you get Tom, his brother, actually visiting and making some of these dimensions, and we discover that, yes, the house is in fact actually off, but it's not just off by 1/4 inch. By the time Tom is helping measure it, it's now off by 1/2 inch. It's a 1/2 inch bigger now inside than it is outside, which is even weirder. That's basically the most essential revelation that is made in chapter 4. We get some ramblings at the beginning of it within the Navidson record about the uncanny, things being uncanny, things being unnatural and uncomfortably so, in ways that we sometimes can't entirely explain. That's something that goes into a little bit of detail. Johnny Truant goes into multiple multi-page footnote ramblings about his job, I think, in here, and about weird experiences that he's been having with regard to his job, and kind of feeling weird and sick sometimes that he thinks might be associated with his obsession as he's been diving deeper into the Navidson record and piecing this thing together, spending long hours, suddenly hours or even 12-hour periods of time are able to pass without him ever having noticed his phone going off or anything like that, because he's just so engrossed in this project. So yeah, you have a little bit more of some of that rambling from Johnny Truant too in chapter 4. Let's see. You also have a little bit of Johnny Truant meeting a random stripper who he starts to fall for very much against, the advice of literally every person ever in this chapter. It's not that big of a deal in this one. Actually, that might not even really start to happen until chapter 5. This might... Chapter 4's footnote, or the second footnote anyway, might actually just be primarily where Johnny Truant had apparently found and talked to somebody who had helped Zampano compile some of the information that's been, compiled for this Navidson record commentary, and some of the, I guess, the kind of angles that you can approach the analysis of the book from that side. So yeah, ignore me about that hooker stuff going on. That all starts to happen in chapter 5 when that becomes a bit much. But yeah, like I said, chapter 4 definitely gives us the more explicit, yeah, there's definitely something wrong with the house. It is different and it is bigger inside than it is outside. And that's like the biggest thing that happens in it. But chapter 5 is the most significant chapter of the book thus far. That is for sure. And that's not just because it's the longest chapter in the book so far. It's like 35 pages. It was quite lengthy. It's also because it sent us to the very end of the book with appendices 2D and 2E, which give us a little bit of background about Johnny Truant's background, which kind of gives us a little bit more insight to his character and explains to us a little bit why his ramblings are so out there and so random and basically irrelevant as they are, especially in chapter 5. This happens a lot. As I said, Johnny Truant's has very many of these multiple page long footnotes that go over this obsession that he has and this having fallen for a stripper for some reason, which hasn't really come around to mean anything yet so far. I'm not very far into the book, to be fair, so it's kind of hard to say what all of that's about, but you start to get the sense, very keen sense, that Johnny Truant's kind of off his rocker to some degree. He has more weird occurrences that happen at his job and stuff like that, probably as a result of this book, presumably, as he seems to understand it anyway. You have some more of that kind of mental obsession with the stripper that's brought up a few more times. And at the very end of the last major footnote of chapter 5, it does take us to appendices, like I said, 2D and 2E. Let me see if I can find where those are at. These were very fascinating. I read these this morning, whereas I read chapter 5 yesterday. At the time of recording this, at the time of this video's coming out, it would be yesterday and the day before. Where, yeah, Appendix 2D is the obituary of Johnny Truant's father. So we get the idea that Johnny Truant's father died when he was pretty young. I'm not entirely sure how young, but it seems like he was a preteen, maybe even still like in single digits when this happened, if I'm not mistaken. It's kind of hard to tell. He might have been around 10 years old, somewhere thereabouts. And then Appendix 2E is a lot of pages of letters from Johnny Truant's mother coming out of a mental institution called Three Attic Whalestow, where you get to see the absolute off her rocker that Johnny Truant's mother was. And these letters give us some pretty good ideas as to at least like a little bit of Johnny Truant's background. You know, you get the sense that you can't entirely trust these letters because Johnny Truant's mom is crazy, and you can tell partway through she stops taking her medication. She starts getting very paranoid about like the director of the institute and some other stuff like that. There may or may not be a couple of directorial changes while she's there that might just be her own paranoia having suggested that the directors changed, even though they haven't. But yeah, you get some ideas that Johnny Truant was kind of an aggressive kid, that he got into fights a lot, that he's bounced back and forth between a lot of different, temporary housing facilities as a kid, as a preteen, and as an early teenager. There's a lot of trauma here going on, of course. Very near the end, we get some raving lunatic ramblings from his mother about how she didn't mean to like almost kill Johnny. It seems like she might have nearly strangled Johnny to death, and that's what put her in the institution, was her father managing to stop her and sending her to the institute. And Johnny's father died, and that's why Johnny's now in like different like foster institutions and bouncing between all of these. And there's developmental issues, there's trauma issues, there's a lot of stuff going on in Johnny's background that's like, it's a lot. There was also like one particular, like, how many pages was this? There's like a 1, 2, 3 page letter in here from Johnny's mother to him at the end of the appendix that took me like an hour to read. because the letter prior to that says, like, pay attention. In the next letter, I will encode as follows. Use the first letter of each word to build subsequent words and phrases. Your exquisite intuition will help you sort out the spaces. I've sent this via a night nurse. Our secret will be safe. Tenderly, Mom. And that's, yeah, the next letter is just these next 3 pages here, and just piecing together the first letter of each word over these 3 pages into its own message was insane. And then trying to read this letter just straight up as is anyway, just to see what's in the rambling nonsense, is it's crazy, and also nonsensical, just absolutely, utterly nonsensical. And then starting on like the second page of the letter, the second and third page, not even on the third page even, it's basically just the second page. You have another secret message that's kind of happening in there, where random letters of certain words are capitalized that shouldn't otherwise be capitalized, and those have like their own secret message in there that I have no idea what that message means. But there is very clearly evidence that Johnny Truant's mother was completely off her rocker, and at the very end of this sequence of letters, there's also a letter in here randomly that, like, I have no freaking idea what this one is doing, what it says at all. Like, not even a sliver of a guess. Can't put any of that together at all. Sections of this get pretty crazy, but near the end of Appendix II.E, you get a couple letters from the director of Whalestow Institute that are sent to Johnny that suggest that, oh yeah, your mother's going to be going downhill here. She seems to be going downhill. I'm not sure she's going to make it out. By the way, I'm retiring at the end of X month, and, you know, this other person's going to be taking my place, and I'm sure he'll take good care of your mother. You get a couple more letters from his mother here, talking about that director leaving, and then another one a couple months later that's just like, that's a lie. The director didn't actually leave. He's the same as he always was. He's still here, blah, blah, blah. So you know that she's off her rocker. And like I said, suggests that maybe one other time that she had talked about the director changing at one point, that maybe he probably didn't actually. And then you get another letter from the Institute on May 5th, 1989, that Johnny Truant's mother killed herself by asphyxiating using a bedcloth on May 4th, following her very last letter being from May 3rd, where she had talked about Johnny's father coming to pick her up very soon. So very tragic stuff going on in this backstory here. You also have a receipt at the very end as well that suggests that Johnny had picked up a jewelry piece from the Institute that had previously belonged to his mother there. And I recall one of Johnny's rambling footnotes somewhere talking about some piece of jewelry, and I just, for whatever reason, can't remember exactly what it was. It's kind of bothering me even. But yeah. Yeah, that's something that happened. So we have some backstory as to some of the implicit backstory of Johnny Truant that kind of starting to make a little bit more sense, what some of his ramblings are about in his footnotes, but not all of it. Not all of it makes sense. A lot of it's pretty complicated even. But we should just talk about Chapter 5 at this point, because Chapter 5... absolutely crazy chapter. It was really cool, actually. It was one of those moments where I started to have a little bit more of that Infinite Jest type of feeling while reading the chapter, just like, okay, what in the world does any of this have to do with anything? Because the first several pages are talking about, like, the Greek myth about Echo, you know, and the importance of Echo, and this sort of develops into the commentary within the Davidson record of, like, how how echoes form, and like how much space is actually required for echoes to occur, and just a lot about this, and like the resonant frequencies of places, and, you know, some other technical jargon that's just like, what in the world are we even doing here? I'm like, my eyes are glazing over at some points. I'm just like, okay, what's the point of all this? And then finally you actually end up getting the sequence of what we call exploration number 4, where you actually have Davidson, or sorry, not exploration number 4, exploration number 1, if I'm not mistaken. Where in the world is it? Yeah, exploration A, sorry, that's what it is. You get some more references to like the 5.5 minute hallway, some other stuff about like Karen's and Davidson's disagreements about a new change that has occurred in the house. One day they discover there's a new hallway in the house that should exist by going out into the backyard, but looking out into the backyard, that hallway is not out there. So there's obviously a room in the house that should not possibly be able to exist, and Davidson's super curious. He wants to explore it. And you know, he and Karen have like a lot of like tension regarding this new room that confuses them. Karen's basically made essentially the implicit threat that like she'll leave with the kids if Davidson goes into the hall, and Davidson's like, yeah, but if she's going to continue being this cold about it, I'm just going to go into the room, because why not? So you have a lot of tension happening in here because of this new room, and echoes that are coming from this new room that shouldn't be able to come because there's not enough space for that to be possible, but it's still happening. Again, echoes are kind of brought into all of this. And finally, near the end of chapter 5, you actually have the exploration, which is called Exploration A, where Davidson is given time out for some reason. I forget the reason off the top of my head. He's forced to sleep not in the bedroom one night, and he decides that if he's not even going to be in the bedroom, he might as well just go ahead and explore the hallway. So he does that. He goes into the hallway, he takes a camera with him, and we get to explore some of the footage of this. And this is where you have like the back rooms. You know, this book here is basically combining the back rooms, that kind of liminal space idea of the back rooms, with your other normal found footage type of stuff going on. Like Paranormal Activity meets the background, or the back rooms might be a little bit of some way to describe kind of what's going on with the Davidson record. It's really cool stuff, and the exploration is super, super unsettling. I did not think that this would get to me, but you have Davidson going into the hall. It's just like, okay, it's this really long hallway. What's to it besides just to go down? And then all of a sudden he goes down and he turns, and then he turns again, and suddenly there's a doorway in the wall that wasn't there before, and he decides to go through that, and he continues just going through this maze of directions, further and further into this liminal space of like, there's just hallways upon hallways and doorways and stuff here that cannot possibly exist within this house. Like this doesn't actually exist in the real world, but I'm in here. And then he ends up in a very large space, a large room that he very nearly gets like stuck in by not being able to find a wall. And some of the aspects of the room are changing while he's in there. He leaves like a penny by one particular doorway because it's not the doorway that he came into the room through, but he's like going to explore in there just to see if he can find the way back through there. And he can't, so he comes back into the room. He decides he's going to just follow along the wall one direction or the other to see if he can find the pillar that he had gone through. And at one point he's gone down a little ways. He turns around and the penny's right in front of him with the pillar that he came in through somehow, even though that doesn't make any sense. And then he also starts to hear the calls of his daughter for some reason in the hall, and he has to like find his way back to his house. Thankfully, his wife had not like awoken and found that he had been exploring in there. He was able to just tell his wife, it's like, it's okay. The daughter was just, had a bad dream. She had a nightmare. And so he's able to hide from Karen, his wife, that he explored this hall and had a very, very bad experience in there. Like that's pretty upsetting experience. And that takes us into chapter 6, which is just a couple of pages long with more rambly endnotes from Johnny Truant's part that I'm still trying to kind of work through. Very rambly in that one. That was like stream of consciousness type stuff that mostly flew over my head. But chapter 6 itself is, like I said, just a couple pages long, where Davidson himself is finally talking with Karen. It's just like, okay, well, this is kind of unsettling. I get where you're going. Like, this is actually pretty not great. We're going to just go ahead and invite some people to not necessarily investigate this for us, quote unquote, but rather to let them know that this is a thing that exists, and then we're gonna move, is kind of the unspoken agreement that happens. And I think that chapter 7 is largely going to be about that kind of exploration, the person who's supposed to come and take a look at the house with them. But chapter 6 also gives us a little bit of something that is apparently glossed over otherwise, that doesn't really come back in the rest of this material, where at one point they have the door into this hallway that's supposed to go into the backyard, but obviously doesn't, because it doesn't really exist. Or maybe it does, or maybe it doesn't. It's hard to, liminal spaces, you know, this weird, crazy house stuff. Chapter 6 features a moment where that door is open, and like the dog and cat, the pets of the house, like zoom through this door, and like everybody's like freaking out, just like, no, don't go down there, like come back. But then they realize that the dog and cat are in the backyard actually, and that for some reason the pets are not able to be within this new addition to the house that's not supposed to exist, that they're not limited to being able to be in there, that it's only the people who can be in there, and that apparently nobody thinks to actually like make any real explorative point about what this might mean and what to do about that, right? They don't make any further explorations about that, apparently, because it's just going to be the people exploring it, supposedly, I guess, is kind of the point that's being made. But that's as much as I got read prior to this diary. I was hoping I could get through like chapter 9 or so, because after chapter 9 is when you start having a lot of like the space in between chapters. So like getting from chapter 9 through the end of the book probably wouldn't be like that much to talk about, relatively speaking, but I would expect for the next one of these diaries to be pretty meaty, because it's going to be covering basically the rest of the book, my impressions of like the entire puzzle after it's put together, after I finished reading it. But as far as like first impressions here, I'm really enjoying this. I'm really into it. I'm really enjoying being able to work for what's coming out of this, for what I'm getting from it. I have a keen sense of investment with House of Leaves that I haven't had with most of the books that I've read this year, quite frankly. I have not read that many books this year. I want to say it's only been like 28 books, 27 books. It's not been that many books that I've read this year. Most years, or at least the last couple of years by this point, I would have read like 35 plus by this point. And here I am with like only 20 something. And to say that House of Leaves has been the one I've been the most invested in of probably the vast majority of those I've read so far this year is a really good sign so far, and I'm hoping it keeps that up, and I'm looking forward to continuing. But this video was a little bit longer than I'd hoped it would be, but not that much longer than I expected it to be. But either case, thank you for watching this. I hope you enjoyed. If you're somebody who's read House of Leaves, I'm really looking forward in 2 weeks from now, in a fortnight, being able to have the other diary where I'll go over a little bit more of my thoughts on the rest of the book, and I hope that you'll stick around for that. For now, I've been your host, King Crusoe. You can call me KC, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.